I'm Stephanie Rentz, the coordinator of the Creative Writing Program. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Before I get started introducing Siri Hustvedt, a couple of announcements. First, I want to thank the McFarland Center for co-sponsoring this event with the Creative Writing Program. And I also want to remind you of one final bonus reading, which is 2 weeks from today. April 24th, Leah Hager-Cohen will be reading from her new novel here in Ream at 7:30 p.m. Okay. I'm pregnant and out of breath. So I first encountered Siri Hustvedt's work when I was a few years out of college, not much older than many of the seniors here. I'd recently quit a perfectly good job as a reporter in rural Idaho, stuffed everything I possibly could into 2 body-sized duffel bags, and flown out to New York City on a ticket in my brother's name. This was in the mid-90s, long before airport security, and I had about $2,000 to start my new life. A friend lent me the Blindfold, Hustvedt's debut novel about a young woman named Iris who moves from the Midwest to New York City to start a PhD program in literature at Columbia University. Over the course of a few years in the novel, Iris is both physically and emotionally bludgeoned by the city. She's groped by a male friend. She's blindfolded by her lover and forced to endure rough sex. She's photographed by a man who takes a picture so disturbing that Iris begins disavowing her identity when strangers ask her whether she is indeed that girl. Critics have noted that the book explores the difficulty of forming a female identity under the ever-present scrutiny of the male gaze. But at the time, for some reason, I found the book weirdly hopeful. Perhaps because even after all of this, Iris still manages to fly from the final pages, running, as she notes, like a bat out of hell. I liked the book so much that when my friend asked me to return it, I had a sudden irrational urge to lie and say I'd lost it. But I didn't. And I'm happy to say that the friendship did not end, and I now own my own copies of Hustvedt's novels, which has given me more time to think about them. So I just want to offer a few observations. First, Hustvedt's prose style oftentimes feels effortless. Her first-person narrators, some female, some male, speak in mostly spare and unadorned voices, their language seemingly translucent. But this simplicity is really deceptive, because what runs through all her works is an awareness of the trickiness of language, its imprecision, and also its impoverishment. Your poetry is cracked, an anonymous quack writes to Mia, the poet narrator of Summer Without Men, a novel about Mia's efforts to pull herself back together after her husband of 30 years puts their marriage on pause. Nobody can understand it, this emailer continues. Nobody wants twisted shit like that. Who do you think you are? Signed, Mr. Nobody. I read the message several times, Mia reflects. The more I read it, the more peculiar it became. The repetition of nobody followed by the pseudonym Nobody made it sound as if nobody, did understand it and did in fact want twisted shit. Who do you think you are became another question entirely in this case. Elsewhere in Hustvedt's work, pronouns like he and she are deliberately loosened from their reference so that we're missing crucial pieces of information. And the characters themselves are painfully aware that everything they have to say, even when they're speaking from their hearts, has already been said before. The second thing I want to say about her novels is that although they often initially present themselves as mysteries, they always subvert the form. The Sorrow of an American, a book about grief set in the aftermath of 9/11, opens with the narrator Eric and his sister Inga finding a mysterious letter among their dead father's papers. Dear Lars, the letter reads, I know you will never say anything about what happened. We swore it on the Bible. It can't matter now because she's in heaven, or to the ones here on earth. I believe in your promise, Lisa. The rest of the novel explores in small parts Eric's attempts to learn Lisa's identity and his father's role in the death of an unnamed person. And yet it's more complicated than that, which is why the novel has stayed with me. We turn to literature to help us understand the complexity of our lives, and often literature succeeds. But sometimes we get to the end of a novel where the mystery is solved and the plot tied up neatly, and the conceit of realism with X leading to Y leading to Z feels a little thin. In contrast, at the end of The Sorrow of an American, when Eric has met Lisa and had all of his questions answered, it turns out that Eric's questions are far more fundamental, what he wants to know, much more profound. I was looking for more, he thinks, more than descriptions of a way of life that's now gone, more than the story of Lisa. I was looking for a path that would take me inside of a man. Which brings me to the final thing I want to say about Hustvedt's work. Her novels are always concerned with the complexity of identity. The fact is, we don't have paths into other people. We don't really have clear paths into ourselves. But out of this sense of isolation and confusion, of never entirely knowing others, and not really understanding ourselves, grow desire and love, art and literature. We inch down the thorny path of discovery and communication by inventing metaphors and writing stories, or, as Hustvedt's characters do, by making fairy tale boxes and paintings, elaborate quilts, and intricate toys. Or if you're Hustvedt herself, you produce a considerable oeuvre of work that includes 6 novels, 3 essay collections, a work of nonfiction, and a book of poems. So a final thing to say about Siri Hustvedt, she has all kinds of impressive awards and accolades. She's won a number of very impressive awards, including the 2012 International Gabarron Prize for Thought and Humanities. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages. I just learned tonight that she's a best-selling author in Germany. People stop her on the street and recognize her. And finally, her most recent novel, which is on sale out in the lobby, The Blazing World, was just released in March and has been getting glowing reviews everywhere. So I'm really thrilled to have Siri Hustvedt here talking about the vocation of the writer. Please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I always think that that's why there's something nice about writers talking about other writers, because they get it, usually a lot better than most reviewers. I was 13 years old when I decided I wanted to write. I was standing at a window in a house my family had rented in Reykjavik, Iceland. It was late at night, and the streets beyond were illuminated by a pale midnight sun. My head was full of David Copperfield and Jane Eyre, the books I had read most recently during a summer when mostly what I did was read. Dickens and Bronte's novels had overwhelmed me, had made me feel I had seen into some truth about the world. And I thought, if this is what books could do to people, I wanted to write them. I remember this moment at the window, or rather, I have codified the moment in memory as epiphanic, even transcendent. Transcendent, according to the first definition in Webster's, going beyond the limits of ordinary experience. In an essay written in 2004 called Extracts from a Story of the Wounded Self, I describe that memory as stubborn and potent. I write about my love for the 2 orphans, David and Jane. This is a quote. I surrendered the whole force of my empathy to the hero and heroine of those novels. Nevertheless, when I read about their sufferings and humiliations, my grief for them was a kind of safe translation, a reinvention of my own emotional life. Through them, I was able to make a turn in myself, and somehow that view through a window, seen alone and at night, has become an image of what I now recognize as the end of my childhood. End quote. After that day in 1968, I began writing poems and stories. very bad ones, with the idea that I would spend my life doing it, and I have continued to think of fiction as a vehicle of truth. When I am writing fiction, what I am searching for is truth, a resonating, emotional truth which is intended as a gift to another, the imaginary reader. Language, as Wittgenstein argued in the Investigations, is by its very nature shared. There can be no truly private language. Once a language is invented, it can be taught and learned. Every word, every story is for someone else. It is intersubjective. This means simply that an I implies a you. A book exists to be read and comes alive in the body of its reader. A book is only words printed on a page, and yet the words create worlds in the reader, which is both strange and remarkable when you think about it. How can little black hieroglyphs on a page live inside us? How we acquire language is a subject of raucous controversy. But it is clear that before infants understand words, they are robust communicators with the people in their lives and engage in wordless dialogues with their parents and siblings and friends and strangers. These pre-speech interactions become part of a developing motor, sensory, emotional self, a biological self. I will not develop this, but brain research has shown that experience affects brain development. The brain, the neocortex in particular, is plastic. It changes. And the neural circuits change in relation to what happens to us. One group of researchers did an empirical study of early vocal interactions between mothers and their babies and notated both verbalizations and pauses. The baby learns to expect one response or another, and temporal patterns are established between them. Patterns that had predictive implications for the child later in life. I am saying something simple but important. Before a child develops reflective self-consciousness, the ability to think of herself as an other to herself in symbolic representations, to use pronouns and tell stories. She has been deeply immersed in the rhythms and sequences of words, has engaged in what psychologists call Proto Conversations, which are biologically coded through emotional meanings, the values of feeling good and bad, what Freud called the pain-pleasure series, a mammalian, not uniquely human reality. These pains and pleasures in relation to others and the world become a kind of bodily memory. We do not consciously remember our infancies, but they remain in us nevertheless. Research on the development of narrative in children shows that storytelling too emerges from dialogue. A parent or caretaker is inevitably part of the process. A father asks his son questions about an event, prods the boy for embellishment, and together they shape the story of going to the doctor for a flu shot or invent a fantasy narrative about the monster in the closet who will only eat peanut butter sandwiches. What does a child's acquisition of language have to do with writing fiction? It is key to the true story at its most fundamental level, to telling the truth in a book that is not about actual events that took place in the world, but true in another way. Theoretically, of course, the fiction writer can write anything. There are no limits on imagination. Alice shrinks and swells in Wonderland. Margarita flies over Moscow on a broom. Frankenstein's monster looms over his creator. What is the imagination, and what is its relation to truth? For a long time now, I have been circling and recircling the problem of fiction and the origins of creativity in novels and essays. Writing is a vocation, a calling, but I'm also interested in why I write and why it feels to me to involve truth, not lies. I have heard a number of novelists refer to themselves as professional liars, and every time I hear it, I cringe. And yet, if the fictional worlds of David Copperfield and Jane Eyre are invented worlds that sprang from the heads of Charles Dickens and Charlotte Bronte. Oh, I have Wuthering Heights in my mind. Charlotte Bronte. How is it possible to think of them as forms of truth? In Anglo-American analytical philosophy, probably not so many of you out there, but if you are, much has turned on this problem, the so-called paradox of fiction. Isn't it irrational for people to respond emotionally to fictive characters and events? For the analyticals, as I call them, true and false propositions rule. The logic goes like this. 1, response condition, I'm putting myself in here. SH, Siri Hustvedt, feels emotions for DC, David Copperfield. 2, belief condition. SH knows DC is imaginary. 3, coordination condition. In order for SH to have genuine emotions towards DC, she cannot believe that DC is purely imaginary. This logical conundrum has led the philosopher Kendall Walton to argue that when people read fiction, they do not have real emotions, but what he calls quasi-emotions. The underlying assumption here is that emotions are rational forms of cognition. I could only be afraid when I know an object is genuinely dangerous to me, sometimes called the appraisal theory of emotion. I see a grizzly bear on the road and freeze in terror because my life is in danger. But I've often had fears about a future that doesn't yet exist. One I simply imagine. A phobic is aware that his strangling fear of elevators is not rational. Writing my own works, I have felt terrible sorrow for a hapless character I know perfectly well is my own creature. Perhaps the most pointed example of emotional relations between real and pretend people is sexual arousal. R is reading Fanny Hill and knows that the narrator is a fictional character. But when she arrives at the passage when the errant fingers of the narrator's mistress make their way down to the place on Fanny's body she refers to as Mount Pleasant, our reader feels a suspicious sensation in the very same spot on her own body. Has R been gripped by a case of quasi-lust? The view of fiction in these philosophical discussions is curiously disembodied, blind to human development, and divorced from the realities of subjective and intersubjective experience. The idea that genuine emotion must follow only from a belief condition that posits the object in question as real arises from a rigorously logical but finally obtuse faith in that same logic as fully explanatory of human experience. Telling, reading, and writing stories are intersubjective acts. They link me to you. While reading, I enter David Copperfield, who narrates his own life in the novel named after him. And David's voice becomes my internal voice while reading. Only when I stop reading the novel am I able to reflect on what I have read and reclaim my own I voice, my own internal narrator. We cannot maintain two narrative voices simultaneously. At least I cannot. Reading and writing a novel require a leap into another life, into other lives, a leap that is not purely rational and also has its origins in bodily processes. When we interact with a real person in the world, we have an automatic physiological mirroring response that happens below the threshold of our awareness. Mirror neurons were discovered in 1995 in the premotor cortices of macaque monkeys. The same neurons fire when a monkey performs an action and when a monkey watches that same action being performed, although the activation in the performer is stronger than in the observer. There are also mirror mechanisms in human beings. Vittorio Gallese, one of the researchers on the team, has developed a theory called embodied simulation to address this reflective relation we have to others, subpersonal, as they say. Well before mirror neurons, the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty coined the term intercorporeity, or sometimes intercorporeality, an immediate, unreflective, that is, unthinking, bodily grasp of the movements and gestures of others. We do not have to think about what the other is doing. Although at some point we may consciously reconstruct the act or analyze the other person's intentions, much of our relations with other people is pre-reflective. Embodied simulation is not only activated by real others. It happens when we watch films, look at photos, paintings, dance, and when we read novels. A 2008 neuroscience paper by Jabi et al., following earlier work on mirror mechanisms, asked the following question. Similar brain regions are involved when we imagine, observe, and execute an action. Is it the same for emotion? The researchers had their subjects scanned using fMRI, I'm sure everybody knows about this now, while they watched someone else experience, and imagined experiencing disgust. The disgusting object they chose was a bitter, unappealing liquid in a cup. They found that linked brain regions, or what they call shared circuitry, I have some problems with these metaphors, but that's another lecture, were activated in all three conditions. It is not my intention to reduce imaginative experience to fMRI findings. However, this study and many others underscore the emotional potency of the imagination. My feeling of happiness, my looking at the radiant happiness in your face, and my imagining feeling happy are not distinct, compartmentalized states, but related states that belie the necessary truth conditions of the analyticals. Therefore, we do have relations with fictional characters in their stories, and during those relations, it appears that the same mandatory unconscious mirror mechanisms are at work. But what about writing fiction? Years ago, in 1995, I wrote this sentence in an essay. Writing fiction is like remembering what never happened. This felt exactly right. The act of writing a novel is very much like unearthing a memory, dredging it up from the depths of my mind and trying hard to get it right. Not long ago, I stumbled over a similar comment made by Graham Greene. Here's the quote. So much of a novelist's writing, as I have said, takes place in the unconscious, in those depths. The last word is written before the first word appears on a paper. We remember the details of our story. We do not invent them. End quote. I, like Greene, feel that the story is already there, waiting to be remembered. I do not feel that the process is one of invention, despite the fact that the work in question is not autobiographical or directly out of my real experience. Can the mental images of autobiographical memory and those of imagining be distinguished? When I examine the two in my mind's eye, which is hard because concentrating on a mental image often makes it vanish, I have a strong sensation of likeness. Our memory pictures, as we know, are not reliable. They too shift and mutate over time. You and I attended the same party and may remember it not just from different perspectives, but I insist the man in the red tie vomited on the sofa and you recall him slapping the hostess. How can we remember so differently? Memory, like dreaming, appears to partake of displacement and condensation. Perhaps I conflated two memories. Maybe you have. Maybe someone told me the story about the man in the red tie throwing up on a sofa, and now I see it in my own mind, as if I had witnessed the unpleasantness myself. Once an image has entered the mind, it can be difficult to trace its origin. The relation between memory and imagination is an old, not a new idea that can be traced to the Greeks. Both remembering and imagining are distinct from immediate perception and involve pictures in the mind. Giambattista Vico, that's 1668 to 1774, the philosopher and historian, regarded memory and imagination as part of a single faculty. Imagination, he said, was expanded or compounded memory, and although memory, sensation, and imagination all pertain to the mind, they had, according to Vico, their roots in the body. In this, he forcefully disagreed with Descartes, whom he addresses often in the New Science. Descartes' radical doubt about everything resulted in his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, through which mind and body became two, not one. He was a dualist. Although the mind-body problem is far from over, I side with Vico on this question. Memory, sensation, and imagination are of the body. And yet, how we understand the psychological as opposed to the biological remains a huge philosophical conundrum, despite all sorts of arguments that hope to make the division vanish. It persists. Nevertheless, studies on people with brain damage that involve the hippocampus, a part of the brain that has been connected to autobiographical memory, have shown that these patients not only remember poorly, they imagine badly. Their fantasies lack the detail and vividness of those of us who have no injury. Two scientists, Randy Buckner and Daniel Carroll, have proposed that the same core brain networks are involved in autobiographical memory, navigation, understanding the minds of others, and imagining the future. All of these are crucial to writing fiction. Even in terms of brain physiology, there is reason to link memory and imagination. I am now working on a paper I will give at an interdisciplinary symposium at Lake Como this June. The conference is called As If: Figures of Imagination, Simulation, and Transposition in the Relation to the Self, Others, and Arts. My paper is Subjunctive Flights, Thinking Through the Embodied Reality of Imaginary Worlds. I write, I have to write. But how do I know what story to write? Why one story and not another? And in what way can that story be said to be true? In a chapter on fantasy and the adolescent, the Russian psychologist Vygotsky writes, quote, "Everything that necessitates artistic transformation of reality, everything that leads to inventiveness and the creation of something new, requires the indispensable participation of fantasy. In this way, some writers quite rightly contrapose fantasy as creative imagination to memory as reproductive imagery." End quote. Here Vygotsky forges the old link between imagination and memory. But what good is this fantastic daydreaming to the young person who lies on her bed and spins out possible scenarios for tomorrow or next week, or indulges in grandiose thoughts about her future when she, Leonora Cuthbert, will find a real-world application for string theory? Vygotsky continues, "But it is also in fantasy that he, the adolescent, is able to discover an effective means of finding a direction for this emotional life and taking charge of it. The unexpressed part of his life finds expression in creative images." End quote. What is unexpressed is expressed in imagination. This is no doubt why I began to write. Inspired by the books that had moved me, I embarked upon a reinvention of my own emotional life. Vygotsky makes the further all-important point that when a poet dissolves in tears over his own lyric, he knows that the verses are fictional. But his tears are real. This echoes Freud's quotation of Stricker in the interpretation of dreams. Although the robbers in a nocturnal hallucination may be fictive, the fear is real. My argument stands in sharp contradiction to Walton's idea that we have quasi-emotions. There are no fictive emotions. There is no physiological evidence that the arousal people experience while reading fiction, the changes in their galvanic skin response, an increase in electrical skin resistance during emotional states, or their increased heart rates, are quasi-emotional as opposed to truly emotional. Emotion is often produced automatically before any rational appraisal or judgment takes place. The imaginary grizzly bear can generate genuine fear. What the imaginary bear cannot do is eat you. While I am having an artistic experience, whether as writer or reader, I am protected by an aesthetic barrier. The knowledge that however great my identification with the fictional character is, I can turn away and leave this world. Unless I am mad, I know the difference between the here and now of my immediate perception and the imaginary, or, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, the potential space of the imaginary, which is the space of fiction. In one of my novels, What I Loved, a child dies. I knew this death had to happen and that I, the writer, could not stop it. When I wrote the passage, I was immersed in the horror of Matt's drowning and the wrenching loss experienced by his parents, my narrator, Leo, and his wife, Erica. I saw all of it in mental pictures. I was Leo. Although I ended up rewriting the book 4 times from scratch, I never touched that part of my text until the very last draft. To be honest, I could not bear to reread it. Many people have told me they wept as they read this part of the book. Several parents who had lost children either wrote to me or told me in person that this passage described their own experiences. One woman said to me after a reading, "That's exactly how it was." Of course, it couldn't have been exactly like that. The circumstances of her child's death were different. The book did not retell the particulars of her story. For her, it must have had an emotional reality, a mirroring of her own terrible grief. I was shaken by her words. After all, I have never lost a child. I have only imagined it. She saw my distress and said, "No, it was a good thing. I felt understood." Perhaps what she had experienced in reading the book was also a form of catharsis. The word catharsis appears just once in Aristotle's Poetics, and scholars are still struggling to understand what he meant by it. Catharsis is some form of purgation or purification of the fear and pity the spectator experiences in tragedy. Aristotle tells us that in a well-wrought tragedy, this is Aristotle, he who hears the tale will thrill with horror and melt with pity, end quote. Whether these works of art are purgatives or cleansers, there is a paradox in the idea of tragic pleasure. What we would suffer in life can purge or cleanse us in art. After I finished reading Wuthering Heights aloud to my daughter when she was 11, Sophie said, "Mom, you know what's interesting?" "No," I said. She said, "Great books can be really, really sad, but they're never depressing." I regard this as a profound comment. There are depressing works of fiction. I have read a good number of them, but they are not great works of fiction. Sophie was right. Great fiction has a liberating power. It was that power that made me want to write, that has kept me writing. Where do the stories come from? Their origins are mysterious to the author, which is why so many writers roll their eyes when they are asked, where do you get your ideas? The question is not silly, however. Rather, it is deep and essential. In the abstract for a paper that was originally published in the journal Neuropsychoanalysis in 2011, which is about the self, narrative, and emotional meanings, my abstract ended with this sentence: the secret to creativity is not in the so-called higher cognitive processes, but in the dreamlike reconfigurations of emotional meanings that take place unconsciously. The philosopher Suzanne Langer, in her book Philosophy in a New Key, wrote, "Art is the creation of forms symbolic of human feeling." And, a harder sentence, artistic truth is the truth of a symbol to the forms of feeling nameless forms, but recognizable when they appear in sensuous replica, end quote. The nameless forms and meanings become conscious and symbolic. In their often cited essay on aesthetic ambiguity, Ernst Kriss and Abraham Kaplan wrote about the movement between what they called psychic levels. This is Kriss and Kaplan. The process involves a continual interplay between creation and criticism, manifested in the painter's alteration of working on the canvas and stepping back to observe the effect. We may speak here of a shift in psychic level, consisting in the fluctuation of functional regression and control. When regression goes too far, the symbols become private, perhaps even unintelligible, even to the reflective self. When at the other extreme, control is preponderant, the result is described as cold, mechanical, and uninspired. Poetry is, to be sure, related to trance and dream, but it is also related to rigorous and controlled rationality. No account of the aesthetic process can be adequate without giving weight to this intellectual component. That's the end quote. So, a story emerges from unconscious depths, dreamlike, trance-like, and begins to insist itself on the writer. It may be a memory, a feeling, or an image. But once the story begins to grow, the work involves a continual back and forth motion between immersion and criticism, being the writer and then the critical reader of the text, letting go and pulling back, freedom and constraint. But how does one know what is right and what is wrong? Rightness is words on the page that answer an emotional truth, a truth which is already present in the writer. And therefore, creating a text is an act that mimics remembering. The rhythms, the music, the dissonances of prose are part of this memory. Novels can lie. If the writer evades the emotional truth of a book, he or she is lying. I have felt it many times in novels, have felt that an author escaped to safety, was reluctant to face what should have been faced. I have felt it myself, and then I get rid of the lie and work toward the truth. My first novel, The Blindfold, was born of a feeling. I answered an ad for a writer that had been posted on the bulletin board in Philosophy Hall at Columbia University when I was a graduate student at the time, and very, very poor, I would like to add. My encounter with the man who wanted me to write pornography for him, left me with an uncanny feeling unlike any I had experienced before. And the 4 movements of the novel all address this feeling in one way or another. What I Loved, another novel, began with an image of a very fat woman lying on a bed, dead. She never appeared as a character in the book, but was transmuted into a series of paintings made by one of the characters, Bill Wexler. The narrator, Leo, has bought one painting in the series Bill calls Self-Portraits. I'm just going to read to you what happened to that really fat dead lady. He showed me 6 paintings that afternoon. 3 were finished. The 3 others had just been started, sketchy lines and large fields of color. My canvas belonged to the same series, which were all of the dark-haired young women, but from one work to another, the woman's size fluctuated. In the first painting, she was obese, a mountain of pale flesh in tight nylon shorts and a t-shirt, an image of gluttony and abandon so huge that her body appeared to have been squeezed into the frame. She was clutching a baby's rattle in her fat fist. A man's elongated shadow fell across her right breast and huge belly, and then dwindled to a mere line at her hips. In the second, the woman was much thinner. She was lying on a mattress in her underwear, looking down at her own body with an expression that seemed to be at once autoerotic and self-critical. She was gripping a large fountain pen in her hand, about twice the size of a normal pen. In the third picture, the woman had gained a few pounds, but she wasn't as plump as the person in the canvas I had bought. She was wearing a ragged flannel nightgown and sitting on the edge of the bed, her thighs casually parted. A pair of red knee socks lay at her feet. When I looked at her legs, I noticed that just below her knees were faint red lines left by the elastics of the socks. The theme of eating and starving, anorexia and obesity, deprivation and compensation return throughout the novel. That fat woman set off a whole train of images. The Sorrows of an American began with another image, a girl lying in a coffin in a small room. As I looked at the dead body, I saw her sit up. There is a child in that novel, Eglantine, or Eggy for short, who at one moment in the story falls from a window and is in a coma. She wakes up. I started the book when my father was dying. It is a novel about fathers, trauma, death, and resurrections. The Summer Without Men was generated by the tone of a voice I began to hear, a caustic, ironic female voice, and I knew it was a comedy about a woman whose husband leaves her suddenly and without warning for a younger woman. I have heard many of these stories. They are utterly banal. But then many stories of adultery are. It is all in the telling. One sentence generated the next. Quote, "Sometime after he said the word pause, I went mad and landed in the hospital. He did not say, 'I don't ever want to see you again,' or 'it's over.' But after 30 years of marriage, pause was enough to turn me into a lunatic whose thoughts burst, ricocheted, and careened into one another like popcorn kernels in a microwave bag." Not so long after this, the narrator says, "And the pause was French." Did I know that the book would become a meditation on the problem of difference, not just sexual difference, but difference as a philosophical problem? No, but I believe it was always there, in the underground of that story's world, which must be related to my underground, a geography of the self that includes my forgotten early life with its rhythms and patterns of response that remain of me, in me, as well as all my remembered and forgotten experiences, the people I've known, the books I've read, and the myriad feelings I've had. I know when a book is right because it feels right. And truth? It is the truth of feeling and form. A book is true when its symbolic form fulfills feeling, even when a text is contradictory and speaks in multiple tongues. The novel is a remarkably elastic artistic form. As M.M. Bakhtin theorized in his Dialogical Imagination, it is a form of many voices and many levels of discourse. From this cacophony, one is able to uncover what I call focused zones of ambiguity, in which the reader may recognize herself or himself, not through the stereotypes, cliches, or truisms of the cultural moment. True fiction generates a form of recognition that could not have taken place without the book. This is literature as transcendence. This is what happened to me and why I became a writer. I'm going to leave you with a couple of pages from my most recent novel, The Blazing World. There are many narrators in this book, but the central character is an artist, Harriet Burden, and the following is a passage from one of her many notebooks. Harriet Burden, Notebook M. I am going to build a housewoman. She will have an inside and an outside so that we can walk in and out of her. I am drawing her, drawing and thinking about her form. She must be large, and she must be a difficult woman. But she cannot be a natural horror or a fantasy creature with a vagina dentata. She cannot be a Picasso or a de Kooning, monster or Madonna. No either or for this woman. No, she must be true. She must have a head as important as her tail. And there will be characters inside that head, little men and women up to various pursuits. Let them write and sing and play instruments and dance and read very long speeches that put us all to sleep. Let her be my Lady Contemplation in honor of Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, that 17th century monstrosity female intellectual. Author of plays, romances, poems, letters, natural philosophy, and a utopian fiction, The Blazing World. I will call my woman The Blazing World after the Duchess, anti-Cartesian, in the long run anti-atomist, anti-Hobbesian, an exiled royalist in France, but she was a hard-bitten monist and a materialist who couldn't quite leave God out of it. Her ideas overlap with Leibniz. Had my father known about Cavendish and her links to his hero? Mad Madge was an embarrassment, a flamboyant boil on the face of nature. She made a spectacle of herself, allowed once as a visitor to the Royal Society to watch experiments in 1666. The Duchess, in all her eccentric glory, was duly recorded by Samuel Pepys, who recorded everything. He called her a mad, conceited, ridiculous woman. It was easy. It's still easy. You simply refuse to answer the woman. You don't engage in a dialogue. You let her words or her pictures die. You turn your head away. Centuries pass. The year the first woman was admitted to the Royal Society, 1945. The Duchess sometimes wore men's clothes, vests, and cavalier hats. She bowed rather than curtsied. She was a beardless astonishment, a confusion of roles. She staged herself as mask or mask. Cavalier hat, off to you, Duchess. May its plumage wave. Cross-dressers run rampant in Cavendish. How else can a lady gallop into the world? How else can she be heard? She must become a man, or she must leave this world, or she must leave her body, her mean-born body, and blaze. The Duchess is a dreamer. Her characters wield their contradictory words like banners. She cannot decide. Polyphony is the only route to understanding. Hermaphroditic polyphony. What noble mind can suffer a base servitude without rebellious passions? Asks Lady Ward. But the ladies always win in her worlds, through marriage, beauty, argument, and rank wishful fantasy. Lord Courtship is thunderstruck by the woman's lucidity and feeling. He is reborn instantly. Is this not what I want? Look at my work. Look and see. How to live, a life in the world or a world in the head. To be seen and recognized outside or to hide and think inside. Actor or hermit, which is it? She wanted both. To be inside and outside, to ponder and to leap. She was painfully shy and suffered from melancholia, a drag on her gait. She bragged. She adored her husband. A few sages called her a genius. I am a riot, an opera, a menace. I am Mad Madge, Mad Hatter Harriet, a hideous anomaly who lives at the Heartbreak Hotel near Sonny's Bar on the water in Brooklyn with people straight from the funny papers. Bruno says there are those in the neighborhood who call me the witch. I take it on then, the enchantment of magic and the power of night, which is procreative, fertile, wet. Isn't that where their fear lies? Don't women give birth? Don't we push those squalling babes into the world, suckle them and sing to them? Are we not the makers and shakers of generations? Tiny Gulliver in Brobdingnag looks up at the giant nurse who gives suck to the infant. Quote, no sight disgusted me so much as her monstrous breast. Its size is alarming, and every imperfection of the skin visible. End quote. A Swiftian conflation of microscope and misogyny. But isn't every infant a dwarf at the breast? Mother said, he ran away from me. I want to blaze and rumble and roar. I want to hide and weep and hold onto my mother. But so do we all. Thank you. You know, I'm a rover in intellectual fields. I mean, that's sort of my hobby. What's really interesting, actually, because I've been involved in this thing called neuropsychoanalysis, is that what, cognitive science calls now the cognitive unconscious, something these people never even wanted to think about. Behaviorism just tossed the unconscious out the window. Probably when scientists talk now about the unconscious, it's even bigger than what Freud imagined. I mean, it's huge. That means it includes all kinds of what we think of as higher functions. Like once you learn how to do something in calculus, that's also becomes, anything that's automatic becomes unconscious. These people are very mechanistic. My interest in Freud is, of course, that the idea of the dynamic unconscious, and it does seem to me that there are all kinds of dynamic forms that cognitive science has a very hard time talking about because most of the models they use are static. That's, this is the difference. Freud, of course, tried very hard to tie his work. He was a neurologist, and in this, in 1895, he wrote something called The Project, which was really about neurons. And he wanted to tie psychological functions to neurons. And he wrote it in a great fever, and then he realized that he didn't know enough about the brain to do it. And probably we still don't know enough about the brain to do it. But there are certain neuroscientists who have been looking back at the project and finding all kinds of fascinating things there that, to be honest, I find a little hard to find. But I know these guys are very smart, and I think they're discovering interesting things. I think that when I talk about the unconscious, I'm really saying that I know when I'm writing a book that there are certainly conscious levels. That, of course, I mean, it's that the reason I brought in that Chris essay, the Chris Abraham Kaplan essay, I think, is that this idea that you're constantly moving between levels, because of course you're always judging yourself. But there are times in every book when the darn thing just writes itself. Like, where the hell did that come from? What is going on? And you look at it and you go, I can go with this. This is okay. You feel like some demon, possessed you. Usually this is pretty late in a book. You're going, man, and then suddenly this stuff is just flying out of you, and you don't know how. How is this happening? And for some people, James Merrill, the poet, he believed in, Ouija boards and all kinds of things. He felt that he was possessed. And Miloš, another wonderful poet, he said, I don't know who that demon is that writes my poems. It's like someone else. So these experiences of possession, and, I quoted the Graham Greene where he says, well, it's all there. You're just digging it out. So this has to have to do with both, I think, cognitive and emotional parts of the self that are not always available, but become available in actually in the form. So sometimes I think, fiction can do things that nonfiction can't. It can actually make more potent things. Like I've mentioned this guy who wanted me to write pornography for him. I was, 23. I don't know, there's something about the whole thing. I just got really freaked out. But I realized that making that into the story is not nearly as haunting as what I ended up doing, which is that there was this weird guy who saved the objects of a dead girl, a girl who had been murdered. But there was something about my encounter, you see, that presented itself in that way in the novel as something deeply creepy, not just about, writing some porn for the guy. It's just something very awful. And so in a way, I think the book, the novel, the fiction is more true in some way than telling the story. Everything, that's in here, and that goes for everybody, is also taken from out there. There really is no, we can do the subject-object problem, but actually, the dynamism is the thing. All experiences coded in different ways in us, some conscious, some unconscious, but it's the outside that's filtered through us, so that, the demarcations, this sort of, the Western subject as this monad floating through the world is clearly, a wrong, for me, a wrong theoretical model. And so all of these dialogical ways of thinking about human experience, for me, are far more interesting. And there the division gets far more blurry, because, the I is constituted through the other. I really believe this. There is no, isolated monadic subject. And, for me, all of this, there is this continuum, of what you'd call a mind-body continuum, however you want to think that through. Well, I can't remember. I discovered at some moment in grade school that you could, turn my name around. And so this book is, when I first published it, I remember someone said to me, did you really go around New York in a man's suit, you know? And I said, no. You know, I made things up, but there's no question that I was playing with my own persona. And I put Iris in my own apartment. I mean, in my mental, you know, fantasy when I was writing the book. She lived in my apartment. She kind of looked like me, you know, when I was young. But Iris also has the first person pronoun. It starts the name, and it's the iris of the eye. And she's the narrator, you know, the observer narrator. And after that, I always have the name of a flower for a name of a character in all my books. There's always someone. You know, you run out of the obvious ones. Now I'm into Avon. This is the lesson. But yeah, there's always, so that was the start of something. But yes, I was playing, I thought of that as a kind of distorted mirror of, you know, not my autobiography, but jumping off that experience of being a graduate student, really, really poor, as I mentioned before. I do choose names very carefully. They're always important. I never make a plan, never have an outline, but I have to have what I think of as an arc. You know, it's like I'm going somewhere, and I mean somewhere that I kind of know what it is. And until I have that arc, I can't write the book. I'm actually working on a book now. And the arc keeps shifting. I mean, I'm not writing. I'm just cooking. And the cooking, I'm not going to start writing until I can see something. It's almost, it's a form almost as much as anything else. Like when I was working on The Summer Without Men, I had this, I knew I was going to this moment. The first image was that the husband is walking up the driveway. Well, in the book, you don't see him walking up the driveway, but he drives. But it was that I was going there. So you need some place to go. Because if you don't, your book starts to go like this. You know, as Mickey Spillane once said to me and my husband, nobody writes a book to get to the middle. Nobody reads a book to get to the middle. And he is right. You know, if you can't keep them going in the middle, you're lost. So yeah, it's a sort of almost teleological trajectory. You know, this is the thing, a lot of that stuff for me is not really conscious. I'm not saying, oh, you know, I need to, you know, back up, you know, this person who's such a, and actually there are writers who do. I mean, a writer I admire, Peter Carey, always says, motive. And I go, motive? You know, it's like, I don't know. You know, I'm not doing that. But at the same time, I guess it's, you know, it's part of this feeling that if you are dictating to your characters, you're usually wrong. In fact, you know, there are times when I really want something to happen and it just won't. And it really is because somehow these people in the book have now gotten to a place where they're seemingly acting on their own. And then you know, I think you're making pretty good characters because they don't even obey you anymore. You know, they seem to have their own direction. Strange, but it's really true. Yeah, I'd like people to feel that my characters have bodies, for example. You know, what was it? Who was it? Someone said about Henry James, a writer I love. It was a mean thing, but he said James' characters are like busts with wings. What was it? Anyway, but yeah, I like to feel that they have bodies. And actually, you know, this is something that annoys some people, but my books are also books about ideas. So, and they're, you know, there's kind of, in this most recent book, if you want to, you can look at it as a real conflict between computational theory of mind and more organicist theories. And this Harry character, who's at the center of the book, is on this more embodied organic side. And then there are another character who's really doing this sort of artificial intelligence, cyborgian, you know, AI computational stuff. So that is a conflict of ideas. But I think the way we remember books is how we felt them. In fact, I've read books that I really admired, and I just can't remember a goddamn thing about them. And you go, what happened? Well, I think what happened was that I wasn't really deeply moved by the book. When I'm deeply moved by a book, I remember these scenes very vividly, and indeed, emotion consolidates memory. We remember our lives like that. We remember books like that. We remember everything like that. So I do think there has to be an affective, an emotional component to a work of art, or you're probably going to forget it. Yeah. It's a little T. It's not a big T, the truth word. But in that world of little T truths, it's really important to me. And you said that, as I said, I really find it annoying, the sort of, professional liar thing. I mean, I find it, I don't know, kind of stupid. Why are you doing it then? You say, why? Because, you think it's fun to lie? I mean, I don't get it. And so, I am really trying in some way, have spent a lot of intellectual energy trying to figure out what the heck it is that makes fiction, such an extraordinary thing when it's extraordinary. I mean, that it enlivens and has changed my life. I mean, books have completely altered my life, and I want to know why. I think it's because they've given me truths I couldn't have found without those books. I just wouldn't have been there. And that, you actually enter the consciousness of another. I mean, reading is one of the most intimate, extraordinary things that you can do. And I have actively worked to read against myself. I know this is funny, but it's like, why do I know about Kenneth Walton, this analytical philosopher who I totally disagree with? Because I read this stuff because I think I want to know what they're thinking, and it makes my own mind more elastic and more able to, say, follow, a symbolic logic problem if I need to. And it makes you dance among the different truths that the culture offers. And I guess for me, in fiction, the most profound aspect is, as I said, not the truisms and platitudes that are repeated in a lot of dumb novels. They are. I mean, there's a lot of what I call sociological fiction, and that's fine. Every era has had it. But the books that stay with us, the books that become part of our internal catalog are, and they're different. People have different ones. But it's because they've made some kind of mark, and I think that mark is a very deep one. And it's a kind of emotional, motor sensory experience. And that's when we hold on to them, possibly forever. And I'm not finished with this. I keep, I keep, reading something else. It will go on, I'll be dead before, I'll have solved this problem. But I certainly have thoughts. Yeah. Well, I think that's good. You probably had enough now, kids. Thank you so much.